Imagine a 2-month-old baby, helpless, fragile, and full of life, subjected to a fate that no one should ever have to endure. This is the tragic story of Jasmine Rose Robin, a child whose time in this world was stolen from her by the very people who were supposed to protect her. The brutality she suffered, unspeakable beyond comprehension, shocks the mind and chills the soul. It's the kind of crime that makes you question how such evil could ever take root in a place meant to nurture love and care. A crime so brutal, so unimaginable, it could only be described as pure evil. And the real twist: the hands that caused this violence, the hands that inflicted such pain, belonged to someone Jasmine trusted completely. Someone she depended on. Someone who should have protected her. According to court documents, Jasmine was born premature at just 29 weeks. She spent several weeks in the hospital in Houston, Texas, before being released to the parents on July 3, 2018 as a healthy baby. How did it happen? How could this baby, this innocent child, suffer at the hands of those who were supposed to be her guardians? This is the story of abuse so severe, it will make you question everything you thought you knew about child protection. And the worst part? No one could have predicted what would happen next. The facts? They're chilling. The truth? It's something that no one expected to hear. In the next few minutes, we'll uncover the shocking facts surrounding this crime. The horrific truth that nobody saw coming. Every detail is more disturbing than the last. And you'll see how the system failed a helpless child. What was the real cause behind Jasmine's death? What did the authorities miss? What could have been done to stop it? As we dig deeper, the truth will leave you stunned, questioning everything you've been told about child abuse and the systems meant to protect us. Stay with us, because the details we uncover will not only challenge everything you know about justice, but will also make you rethink the very foundation of how we protect our children. As we dive into the story, you'll be forced to confront the darkest corners of human nature. You'll witness a child's tragic fate, and the unanswered questions that still haunt her memory. In a moment, we'll go back to the beginning, to the moment Jasmine was born, a tiny fighter. But what should have been a story of survival, of hope, would soon become a tragic tale of betrayal, neglect, and unimaginable horror. So let's start from the very beginning. A premature baby born fighting for life in a neonatal intensive care unit. No one could have predicted what was waiting for her when she left the safety of the hospital. No one could have foreseen the tragedy that was about to unfold. Because what happened next will leave you wondering, how did we let this happen? How could we fail Jasmine Rose Robin? Jasmine Rose Robin was more than just a name. She was a fighter. A tiny premature infant born into a world that didn't seem ready for her. Yet somehow, against all odds, she had made it through the hardest part. Born at only 26 weeks, weighing just over 1.5 pounds, her tiny hands and feet barely registered in the eyes of the doctors and nurses in the neonatal intensive care unit. But to her, every breath was a victory. Every moment of survival, a sign of the strength she had within her. Jasmine's life had just begun, yet her battle was already won for the history books. The NICU became her first home, a sterile environment where her tiny body was hooked up to wires and machines, monitoring her heart rate, oxygen levels, and every tiny function of her fragile body. It was in this cold, mechanical world that Jasmine began to show her strength, defying the odds with every passing day. Nurses would marvel at her resilience, talking about how her eyes would follow their movements, how her grip, though weak, held firm when they placed their fingers in her palm. She was a fighter, and though she had yet to speak her first word, Jasmine had already won the hearts of everyone in that hospital. But while Jasmine fought to survive the challenges of premature birth, the world outside that NICU was not as welcoming. You see, her story didn't end when she was discharged from the hospital. In fact, that's when the real horror began. Because what the doctors, nurses, and child protective services didn't know was that Jasmine was being sent into the arms of people who were far from the loving parents they appear to be. This wasn't just another case of neglect, it was a well-hidden, slowly escalating pattern of abuse. But how could this happen? How could such a tiny, innocent life, struggling to survive after being born so early, end up at the mercy of those who should have been her protectors? How could a mother, a father, the very ones who were supposed to cherish and care for her, become the hands of destruction? Her parents, Jasmine Robin Jr. and Catherine White, at first glance, seemed like any other young couple starting a family. In their early 30s, they appeared to be ordinary, maybe even unremarkable. No real red flags to signal any danger. Jason, a man with a calm demeanor, had been seen as reliable by those around him. Catherine, a woman who showed nothing but love for her daughter in public, was the typical picture of a concerned mother, always by her daughter's side. Their smiles in the family photos told a story of happy beginnings, of joy, of life taking its course in a beautiful way. But as we know now, appearances can be deceiving. Behind the walls of their home, the reality was much darker. Beneath the surface, hidden in plain sight, was a deeply disturbing pattern. Jason and Catherine, despite the outward appearances of a loving family, harbored a secret, one that would lead to Jasmine's untimely and tragic death. This wasn't the story of a family falling apart. It was the story of a family tearing itself down from within, one unspeakable act at a time. When Jasmine was finally discharged from the NICU, her parents were overjoyed. It was a moment of victory. The doctors and nurses had congratulated them, telling them how strong and brave their little girl had been. They had every reason to be proud, but those same doctors and nurses couldn't have known the storm brewing at home. They couldn't have known what awaited Jasmine once she was sent back to her parents' care. In the days and weeks that followed, Jasmine began to show signs of distress. She cried more than normal. Her body stiffened in unnatural ways, signs that something was deeply wrong. But her parents, despite being told of her fragile health, chose to ignore the warning signs. They dismissed her crying as nothing more than the typical fussing of a baby. But this wasn't typical. This wasn't the fussy crying of a healthy baby needing a diaper change or a bottle. This was the desperate cry of a child in pain, a cry that should have never been heard. And the bruises, the marks on her tiny body. At first, Jason and Catherine shrugged it off. They were convinced that she was just a normal baby, going through normal growing pains. They brushed it aside as if it were nothing more than a coincidence. But the bruises continued to appear, each time in new places. It wasn't long before Jasmine's cries became more frequent, her body more stiff, her eyes losing their spark. Something was wrong, but it was far too late before anyone would take notice. How could they not see it? How could they ignore the clear signs that something was terribly wrong with their daughter? Was it denial? Or was it something far darker? Were they simply so consumed by their own issues that they couldn't see the pain they were inflicting on their own child? In truth, Jasmine's story was not just about a child's pain. It was about a systemic failure. A failure to recognize the signs, to intervene in time, and to give Jasmine the chance to survive. But it was also a story about the breakdown of trust, the unraveling of a family that had the power to protect its most precious member but instead chose silence. Jasmine was their responsibility, their child, their flesh and blood. Yet she suffered, and the signs of abuse were right in front of their eyes, yet they continued to ignore them. In the next part of the story, we'll look at the signs that should have never been ignored. We'll uncover the warning signs, the missed opportunities, and the moments where Jasmine's cries went unheard. But most importantly, we'll explore what could have been done to save her and why, in the end, it was too late. Stay with us, because the truth of what happened to Jasmine is far more chilling than anyone could have ever imagined. And the real horror, just when you think it can't get any worse, will come crashing down on you. Now, let's move deeper into the story. The investigation begins, and we'll discover how Jasmine's suffering became known to the world, and why it was almost too late. Before we dive deeper into this heartbreaking story, I just want to take a moment to thank all my incredible subscribers who continue to support this channel. Your support means the world to me, and it allows me to bring these important stories to you. True crime documentaries like this one take time and a lot of effort to produce. And it's because of you that I'm able to keep bringing these chilling, eye-opening stories. If you're as shocked and moved by Jasmine's story as I am, hit that like button to show you care about these kids who need justice. Subscribe to this channel so that together we can keep fighting for the voiceless. And don't forget to share this video with someone who still believes that children are safe in their homes. Turn on the notification bell so you're the first to know when I drop another eye-opening video, because we need to keep spreading the word and demanding change. When Jasmine was born, her story was only just beginning. A premature infant, fragile and small, she had already shown incredible strength in the face of overwhelming odds. Her survival was a testament to the resilience she carried within her tiny body. But as soon as Jasmine was discharged from the NICU, that strength, her will to survive, was put to the test in a much darker way. The signs of abuse were there from the very beginning, though they were hidden beneath layers of excuses and inaction. What's worse is that these signs weren't the isolated marks of a child in distress, but the blatant warnings of a child in pain, a child being harmed. But nobody acted. Even before Jasmine was born, Child Protective Services had already received multiple reports raising concerns about her parents. There were whispers, hushed voices, calls made behind closed doors, alerting authorities to a potential danger lurking in the home she would soon be entering. But despite these early warnings, no intervention was made. No action was taken. No one stepped in to protect this baby. And what followed was a tragic series of events that led to her untimely death. It's easy to overlook the early signs of abuse. People, families, will sometimes make excuses for things that don't quite feel right. Sometimes they hide behind the "not my problem" mentality. In Jasmine's case, this was all too real. Child Protective Services had their concerns, but they never acted. The bureaucracy, the slow-moving wheels of child protection, couldn't respond fast enough, couldn't intervene early enough to stop what was about to unfold. Before Jasmine even took her first breath outside the hospital, the whispers were there. Jason and Catherine, her parents, had already been flagged. Child Protective Services had received complaints and reports about them, about their home environment. These concerns weren't isolated. There was a pattern emerging, a history of neglect, signs that should have been red flags, flashing in neon. But, as is often the case with child protection systems, no intervention came in time. The truth is, Jasmine was sent home with the weight of the world on her tiny shoulders. Everyone around her saw the potential for harm, but they failed to take action. Her parents had their own troubles, their own demons, yet they were entrusted with this fragile life, this innocent child who needed protection the most. The signs were clear. The concerns were there. But the system failed her. They failed her. When Jasmine finally came home from the hospital, the world outside should have been a place of love, of care, of peace. She was meant to be cradled by the warmth of her parents, surrounded by safety. But instead, Jasmine was met with an environment that was far from nurturing. Her parents, Jason and Catherine, didn't see what everyone else could see. They didn't hear the alarm bells ringing. They didn't notice the red flags that should have been impossible to ignore. They turned a blind eye. It started with small things, subtle, insignificant to an untrained eye. Jasmine began to cry more often than expected for a child of her age. It was a cry that didn't sound normal, a cry that carried with it a weight of unaddressed pain, a cry that felt deeper than any fussing or hunger. Her parents dismissed it, of course. Just a baby being a baby. Or so they thought. They failed to see what this cry truly meant. The red flags were there from the beginning. Her condition began to deteriorate. But it wasn't something that came on all at once. Jasmine's suffering was slow, gradual. It was a pattern of neglect, of ignorance, of turning away from the truth. Her parents saw bruises on her tiny body. Bruises that no baby should ever have. They saw marks that weren't caused by anything innocent. But they ignored it. They brushed it aside, told themselves it was part of growing up, a clumsy little one struggling with the world. But these weren't normal marks. As the days passed, Jasmine's body grew weaker. Those bruises didn't go away. They multiplied. Every day, new ones would appear, in places that didn't make sense, in ways that no child should experience. But the parents never asked the questions they should have. They didn't care enough to ask why. And that's where the horror began to unfold. Jasmine's cries grew louder, more desperate. She wasn't just hungry. She wasn't just tired. She was in pain. But no one would step in. No one would look closely enough. And as her suffering deepened, her parents remained blind to it, dismissing it with each passing day, pushing the obvious signs further and further down into the pit of denial. Imagine being a mother. Imagine being a father. And seeing your child, your newborn, in pain. Knowing deep down that something is wrong but choosing to ignore it. That was the reality that Jasmine was facing. She couldn't speak for herself. She couldn't defend herself. But in those moments, she was trying to communicate something so desperate, so urgent. The abuse wasn't just about the bruises. It was about the silence. It was about the failure to protect. Every mark on Jasmine's skin, every tear that fell from her fragile eyes, went unnoticed, unheard. Her parents were supposed to be her protectors, but they became the ones who allowed her to suffer. How could they not see it? Was it ignorance? Was it denial? Or was it something darker? Perhaps deep inside they already knew, but the shame, the fear, and the guilt paralyzed them. They became silent witnesses to their own child's agony, unable or unwilling to stop it. And why did nobody step in sooner? Why did the signs go ignored for so long? The system failed Jasmine. The same system that is supposed to protect children like her to step in when a child is in danger. But instead, Jasmine's cries went unheard. Her injuries dismissed as nothing more than part of a normal childhood. This is the heart-wrenching reality of Jasmine's story. A child left to suffer, with warning signs that nobody paid attention to. Her parents, in their own twisted way, failed to protect her. The system failed her. And in the end, it was too late. Jasmine's life, barely begun, was snatched away by the very people who should have kept her safe. And the world would be left asking, how could this happen? How did nobody see it coming? In the next segment, we'll look deeper into the signs that were missed, the moments where intervention could have saved her. Jasmine's suffering could have been stopped, but it wasn't. And that's the painful reality we must face. As days passed, the damage done to Jasmine's fragile body only grew worse. What started as small signs of distress had escalated into something far more severe. Her cries grew louder, more desperate, each one a chilling reminder of the suffering she had endured in silence. What had once been a vibrant spirit, a little girl fighting against the odds, was now a weakened, broken version of herself. Her tiny body, once full of life, now lay stiff, unmoving at times, as if the energy had been drained from her with every passing hour. The bruises, once a few faint marks on her soft skin, now covered her body, some growing larger, some becoming more pronounced. There were new marks appearing each day. Cuts, burns, and contusions. No one could deny it any longer. This was no accident. This was no normal infant injury. This was deliberate. The abuse was escalating. But Jasmine's parents, Jason and Catherine, refused to see what was right in front of them. Perhaps it was easier for them to dismiss the severity of the situation. Perhaps they were so deep in denial that they couldn't admit what they had become a part of. For weeks, the signs were ignored. The suffering was there for all to see, but the realization hadn't hit yet. They couldn't see it. Or worse, they didn't want to. The subtle shift in Jasmine's behavior became undeniable. She had always been a fighter, even as a preemie, and she had survived the NICU against the odds. But now, the same resilience that had once allowed her to defy the odds seemed to be fading away, replaced by a vulnerability that no child should have to feel. Her movements slowed. Her body had lost the strength it once had. She had become a shell of the baby who had once held on to life so fiercely. But Jason and Catherine, blinded by their own shame or guilt, could not, or would not, see what was happening. The signs were there, yet they continued to tell themselves that Jasmine was just a fussy baby, that these things were normal for children. They convinced themselves that this was just part of raising a child, that every bruise, every mark was part of growing up. It was the most dangerous form of denial, one that had fatal consequences. The worst was yet to come. As the days wore on, Jasmine's suffering became unbearable. Her tiny body was pushed to its limits, and with each passing hour her condition worsened. What had been a tragic set of injuries was now a full-blown crisis. The truth could no longer be ignored. This was not just a case of neglect. This was the result of sustained brutal abuse, and the very people who were meant to protect her had turned a blind eye. But things were about to take a turn that no one saw coming. It was the evening of that fateful day when things finally reached a breaking point. Jasmine, once again, was unable to move. Her body was limp, her breathing shallow and labored. She cried out weakly, as if trying to communicate something that could no longer be put into words. This was the moment when everything changed. The cries were louder than ever before, louder than any of the screams that had gone unnoticed before. But the decision to act came too late. The paramedics arrived at their home, their sirens wailing as they rushed to the scene. There was no time to waste. Jasmine's fragile body was transported, cold and lifeless, to the hospital, her chances of survival hanging by a thread. What happened next would change everything. It wasn't just her condition that shocked the medical staff, it was the injuries she had sustained. Jasmine was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. The doctors worked frantically to stabilize her, but the damage was far too severe. As the doctors examined her, they began to uncover the full extent of her injuries. What they discovered shocked even the most seasoned medical professionals in the room. Jasmine's small, frail body was covered with lacerations, contusions, bruises, and signs of blunt force trauma. The bruises on her tiny body were not from a fall, not from a normal child's accidents. They were deliberate. Each mark, each injury, told the story of a child who had been tortured. The autopsy revealed something far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. Jasmine had sustained multiple injuries over a prolonged period, a pattern of abuse that had been ongoing, each incident escalating with time. Her body was a canvas of violence, each bruise a testament to the torment she had suffered at the hands of her parents. This wasn't just a one-time tragedy, it was the culmination of months of torture and neglect, masked by excuses and denial. This was no accident. Jasmine didn't just fall. Jasmine didn't just cry too much. Jasmine didn't just have a bad day. Jasmine was the victim of a calculated, sustained effort to harm her. Someone who should have loved her most became the very hand that inflicted unimaginable pain. This was child abuse of the highest order, and what made it worse? It was done by the very people who were supposed to be the ones to keep her safe. But as the doctors began their examination, a chilling realization began to sink in. Jasmine's injuries were so severe that the possibility of survival grew slimmer by the hour. The doctors did everything they could, but the damage was done. Jasmine's body had endured so much that it couldn't fight back anymore. The poor child was already too far gone. When the news finally came, it hit like a cold wave. Jasmine, the little fighter, the tiny survivor who had made it through the NICU, had succumbed to the injuries. The cause of death: severe abuse over a prolonged period. And what was the worst part of it all? This was preventable. Jasmine could have been saved if someone had taken the signs seriously. If someone had intervened earlier. What had happened to this little girl was beyond cruelty. It was more than just neglect. It was a systematic, prolonged abuse that had been ignored by everyone around her. Her parents, the ones who were supposed to cherish and protect her, had become the very agents of her destruction. And in the end, when it was too late to undo the damage, they were the ones responsible for this innocent child's death. The truth was undeniable. Jasmine had been the victim of a tragedy that could have been avoided. But the scars left on her body, physical and emotional, were a haunting reminder of the failures that allowed this to happen. The signs were all there, but no one acted in time. The failure of the system, the failure of her parents, the failure of everyone who should have been there to protect her. Jasmine's suffering could have been stopped, but it wasn't. In the next part of the story, we will delve into the investigation, where the truth behind the abuse and the failure of those who could have saved Jasmine will finally come to light. The full extent of what Jasmine endured is about to be uncovered. It's a truth so chilling, so heartbreaking, that it will forever change the way we think about the protection of our children. This story is difficult, but it's so important that we keep telling it. I want to take a moment to thank each and every one of you for being part of this incredible community. Your support helps keep these stories alive, and it's because of you that I'm able to give voices to those who can't speak for themselves. These stories take time, research, and a lot of heart to share, and every like and subscribe helps me continue bringing them to you. If you want to be part of the fight for justice for children like Jasmine, like this video, subscribe to stay connected, and share the story with anyone who thinks that this kind of abuse can't happen. We need to open eyes and keep the conversation going. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell. Let's keep pushing for change together. As the paramedics rushed Jasmine to the hospital, it was clear that this was no ordinary case. What had initially appeared as a tragic and unexplainable situation was beginning to unravel into something much darker. But no one knew just how deep the tragedy ran or how much worse it could get. Jasmine's life, though slipping away, had become the key to unlocking a horrifying truth about those who were supposed to protect her. The moment the doctors confirmed her condition, an investigation was inevitable. The case was handed over to Detective Angela Lopez, a seasoned investigator who had seen her fair share of tragedies, but this one was different. The sheer brutality of Jasmine's injuries had caught everyone's attention. But for Detective Lopez, the task ahead wasn't just about piecing together a case. It was about uncovering the truth that had been buried in layers of lies and excuses. She knew there was more to the story than met the eye. And as she delved deeper, she would uncover something far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. What Detective Lopez would uncover would reveal that Jasmine's suffering wasn't an isolated incident. The more she dug into the case, the more a disturbing pattern began to emerge, one that would haunt her forever. This wasn't just one night of rage. This wasn't a sudden outburst. This was calculated. This was ongoing. And this was just the beginning of a much darker truth that had been hidden for far too long. Detective Lopez began her investigation by reviewing the medical reports from the hospital. As she read through them, her heart sank. Jasmine's injuries weren't just a few bruises or minor cuts. These were signs of repeated trauma, injuries inflicted over time, a clear pattern of abuse that no one had taken action on. Jasmine's tiny body had been subjected to blunt force trauma, bruises of varying ages, lacerations, and signs of neglect that were impossible to ignore once you started piecing them together. But it wasn't just the medical professionals who were starting to connect the dots. Detective Lopez soon realized that the timeline of Jasmine's suffering didn't align with what had been told to authorities. The initial reports, the ones that Jason and Catherine had submitted about their daughter's condition, were filled with inconsistencies. They claimed the injuries were accidents. They claimed the bruises were just part of growing up. But as Lopez soon discovered, that story didn't hold water. And the more she pressed, the more holes she found. One of the first steps in the investigation was to perform an autopsy on Jasmine's body. What the coroner uncovered was both chilling and heartbreaking. The medical findings confirmed what Detective Lopez had feared. Jasmine's injuries weren't the result of a single incident. They were repeated, sustained, and calculated. The autopsy revealed deep bruising, internal injuries, and signs of blunt force trauma on her small frame. These weren't accidents. They were deliberate acts of violence inflicted over weeks. And the physical trauma alone didn't tell the full story. It was the emotional toll that was impossible to ignore. The more Detective Lopez looked into the timeline of events, the clearer it became. Jasmine's parents had been covering up their actions for months. There was evidence that Jasmine's suffering had been ongoing long before she was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Jasmine's cries, her weakening body, her increasing list of injuries, they all pointed to one painful, undeniable truth: she had been tortured. But even more disturbing was the fact that no one had intervened. No one had acted to stop this horror before it was too late. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was found in the form of medical records and photographs of Jasmine's injuries from her hospital visit. The reports showed that the injuries she sustained were inconsistent with the explanation her parents had given. They claimed she had fallen, that she was just a fussy baby. But the truth was, Jasmine's body had been subjected to repeated blows, extreme force, and neglect. The photographs told a terrifying story, one of a child who had endured far more than anyone could comprehend. And then there was the timeline. Jasmine had been seen by medical professionals on several occasions prior to her death, each time with bruises and marks that were either ignored or excused. But as the case continued to unfold, Detective Lopez began to connect the dots, tracing the pattern of abuse that had been ongoing. The timeline of Jasmine's suffering stretched back weeks before her hospitalization. Every visit to the doctor, every time she cried, every bruise was dismissed. But now the truth was undeniable. This wasn't a case of bad luck. This wasn't a momentary lapse of judgment. This was a pattern of abuse that had gone unnoticed for far too long. The shocking truth of Jasmine's abuse was only beginning to unfold. Detective Lopez wasn't just looking at isolated incidents. She was seeing a bigger picture. Each new piece of evidence she uncovered pointed to a history of neglect and abuse, one that had been ignored for far too long by everyone involved. Her cries went unheard by the people who were supposed to protect her. Her suffering, her pain, it had all been dismissed. But there was more to Jasmine's story than just the physical trauma. Detective Lopez needed to understand the psychological background, the dynamics between Jasmine's parents, and the underlying issues that led to this tragedy. What motivated Jason and Catherine to harm their own child? What had happened in their lives to make them capable of such evil? The answers, as Lopez would soon discover, were more chilling than anyone could have expected. Jason Robin Jr. and Catherine White weren't strangers to trauma themselves. Jason, with his past of violent behavior, and Catherine, who struggled with her own demons, had a history of dysfunction that, at first, seemed like a distant cause of their actions. But as the investigation moved forward, Lopez began to uncover disturbing connections. Jason's violent tendencies weren't just random outbursts, they were patterns. And Catherine's refusal to act to protect her daughter was rooted in a deep-seated history of emotional neglect and unresolved trauma. As the investigation continued, it became evident that Jasmine had been caught in a cycle of neglect and abuse that had been brewing for years. Detective Lopez was starting to piece together the events leading up to Jasmine's suffering, and every single detail added to the horror. Jasmine wasn't just a victim of one isolated act of violence. She had been the victim of an ongoing pattern of mistreatment and neglect that went unnoticed, unchecked, for far too long. The disturbing truth was now clear. Jasmine had been failed by the very system that was supposed to protect her. The medical professionals who saw her, the family members who were around her, the authorities who were supposed to intervene, they had all missed the signs. They had allowed a child to suffer until it was too late. And now the question became, how many more children had been failed? How many more would suffer before we took action? With the truth coming to light, Jasmine's case was no longer just a tragedy. It was a wake-up call. The investigation had just begun, and what Detective Lopez would uncover in the coming days would shake the very foundation of the child protection system. In the next part of this investigation, we'll see how Jasmine's case became the flashpoint for a much larger systemic issue, one that will challenge us all to rethink how we protect our children. The investigation into Jasmine's death had been a relentless pursuit of truth, an unraveling story that seemed to be gradually reaching its heartbreaking conclusion. Detective Lopez had uncovered the brutality, the neglect, and the systemic failures that allowed such an innocent life to be stolen far too soon. The pieces were falling into place, But in true crime, the truth often comes with a cost, a shocking price that leaves everyone questioning everything they thought they knew. Just when the investigators thought they had pieced together the facts, when they thought they were finally on the verge of bringing justice for Jasmine, a new piece of evidence appeared. One that would shatter the entire narrative. A neighbor's testimony that no one had expected. This wasn't part of the initial investigation. It wasn't something that anyone had seen coming. But what this neighbor had overheard weeks before Jasmine's injuries had an eerie, chilling quality. It painted a new picture, one that no one had anticipated, but one that made everything make sense in a way that left everyone stunned. The neighbor, who had lived next door to Jasmine's family for several months, came forward with something that had seemed insignificant at the time. The testimony wasn't about a single event. It wasn't a specific moment of abuse. No, this was about a series of conversations, a subtle shift in behavior that had been building for weeks. The neighbor described overhearing a loud argument between Jason and Catherine, one that left the walls trembling and the air heavy with tension. But it wasn't just the argument itself that was concerning. It was the nature of the words exchanged. In that argument, Jason's words made something clear that no one had known before. They weren't just arguing about parenting. They were arguing about control, about power, and about the authority he thought he had over Jasmine. Jason had said things in that argument. Things that hinted at his violence, his rage, and his growing sense of entitlement to inflict pain when he didn't get his way. His voice, as described by the neighbor, was not just angry. It was filled with malice. The neighbor didn't think much of it at the time, but now, after hearing about Jasmine's tragic fate, everything clicked. What was once an isolated incident, just another couple's argument, now seemed like a warning. A glimpse into the dark heart of someone who was capable of far more than verbal assaults. It was a window into Jason's soul, a soul that had been slowly eroded by anger, frustration, and an overpowering need for control. This testimony was the first real piece of new evidence that turned the case on its head. It raised questions that no one had dared to ask before. Had Jasmine been exposed to this level of rage from Jason long before the abuse escalated to its deadly climax? Had her life been hanging in the balance from the moment she was born, simply because her father couldn't control his temper, couldn't control his need to dominate? But this revelation wasn't the only twist to come. No, just when the case seemed to be nearing its end, the darkest truth of all was about to surface. Something so shocking, so devastating, that it made everything that came before it seem like a mere prelude to the real horror. What nobody knew, what Detective Lopez had yet to uncover, was that Jason's violence wasn't something that had just manifested overnight. It wasn't some isolated incident of frustration taken too far. No, this was part of a larger pattern of violence, a history that had been buried deep, hidden from those around him. But as all dark secrets eventually do, Jason's past was about to come to light. It was during a routine background check, something every detective must do in order to uncover the full truth, that Detective Lopez discovered Jason's violent history. The truth came crashing down with the force of a tidal wave. Jason Robin Jr. wasn't just a man struggling with life's pressures. He had a long history of domestic violence, assaults, and anger issues that dated back years before Jasmine was born. The man who had claimed to be a loving father, the man who had raised his daughter in what seemed like a normal, if not perfect, household, was hiding a monstrous side that had been kept secret from everyone around him. Jason's violent tendencies had been brushed under the rug. Family members had seen signs, but had been too afraid to speak up. Neighbors had witnessed the occasional outbursts, but they didn't realize the depth of Jason's rage. Friends had written it off as stress, as life's challenges. But now, looking back, the pieces of his past were all too clear. His anger had been a slow burn, a fire that was ignited and stoked by his own insecurities, by his own demons. And as it burned, it spread to everyone around him. What Detective Lopez discovered was horrifying. Jason had a history of abuse, a pattern of escalating violence that had gone unnoticed. It wasn't just a single incident. It wasn't a case of one moment of rage spiraling out of control. This was a pattern of manipulation, a history of controlling his partners with intimidation, And, in the case of Jasmine, his own flesh and blood, it was a pattern of physical violence that no one saw coming. This wasn't just a tragic accident. This wasn't a case of one bad decision. This was the culmination of years of violent behavior, of a man who had learned to hide his true self behind a mask of normalcy. His past wasn't something that had just suddenly appeared. It had always been there, simmering beneath the surface, ready to explode. And Jasmine had become the final victim in a long line of destruction. A child who had no chance against the force of a father who had turned his violence into an art. The question now was not just how to hold Jason accountable, but how had he been allowed to continue living a life where he could hide his violent tendencies so well? How did society, how did the people closest to him, miss the signs of a man who was capable of hurting his own daughter, of killing her? But the most chilling part of this revelation wasn't just that Jason had a violent past. No, the most chilling part was that it wasn't an isolated moment. It was only getting worse. The violence had escalated over time, and Jasmine's death was the final act in a horrifying performance of abuse that had been brewing for years. Jason's history of violence wasn't some distant memory. It was alive, it was fresh, and it was taking a child's life in the most brutal way imaginable. This wasn't just about a broken family. This was about a broken man who had hidden his darkness from the world, who had shielded his cruelty behind a mask of normality. But behind that mask, Jason Robin Jr. was a monster, one who had taken the life of his own child. And the worst part? It was a pattern that started with small signs and built up to this unspeakable act. Jasmine's suffering was just the final act in a lifelong play of pain and destruction. And as the investigation unfolded and the true extent of Jason's violence was exposed, a new question arose. How many children have suffered because of those who should have protected them? How many families have fallen victim to the same blind spots, the same systemic failures that allowed this tragedy to unfold? Jasmine's story is not just a call for justice. It is a call for change. A change that will prevent another child from facing the same fate. A change that will give every child the chance to survive and thrive, free from the horrors of abuse. Jasmine's life was taken too soon, but her story will not be forgotten. In the next part of the story, we'll delve into the legal proceedings and how the justice system would ultimately come to terms with the horrors Jasmine suffered. But even as the court cases unfolded, the real question remains: what will it take for us to truly protect our children? In every tragedy, there is a moment when we ask the question, what could possibly drive a person to commit such horrors? When we look at Jasmine's case, when we look at the suffering she endured at the hands of the very people who should have protected her, it's impossible not to ask that question. What leads someone to harm their own child, to inflict pain so brutal that it cannot be explained away? How did it all begin? And more importantly, how could it have been prevented? The answers to these questions lie not just in the facts of the case, not just in the bruises and injuries Jasmine suffered, but in the minds of her parents, Jason Robin Jr. and Catherine White. It is in their brokenness, in their mental states, and in the trauma that had been festering for years before it reached its tragic conclusion. To understand what happened, we must delve deeper into their psychology, into their personal histories, and into the emotional voids that led to this horror. What makes a person capable of such cruelty? How can someone who, on the surface, might seem normal, loving, and caring turn into a monster, especially towards their own child? To understand this, we have to look at the psychological makeup of both Jason and Catherine, and the deep-seated issues that went unnoticed until it was too late. The first thing to understand about Jasmine's parents is that they were not just victims of circumstances. They were individuals carrying their own baggage, their own trauma, and their own emotional scars. Both Jason and Catherine had histories of dysfunction, histories that set the stage for what would unfold in their home. Jason Robin Jr., though he appeared calm and collected on the outside, was hiding a violent past. The psychological evaluations later revealed a pattern of unresolved trauma dating back to his childhood. Jason had experienced a life filled with neglect and anger. Raised in a chaotic home where love and stability were mere fantasies, He grew up learning to suppress his emotions, to bury them under layers of aggression and defensiveness. But this suppression of emotion didn't just go away. It transformed into something far more destructive. Jason's inability to process his trauma led to explosive outbursts of rage, the kind of rage that could not be controlled, the kind of rage that destroyed everything in its path. His emotional neglect was not just something he had experienced. It was something he had internalized, something he was passing on to his own child. What we see in Jason is a cycle of abuse, a learned behavior passed down from generation to generation. His inability to communicate effectively, his inability to nurture and care, were not just flaws in his character. They were symptoms of deep-rooted psychological wounds. These wounds had been festering for years, invisible to everyone around him. And it was these wounds that led him to lash out violently against the very child who depended on him the most. But it wasn't just Jason's past that set the stage for the tragedy that befell Jasmine. It was also Catherine, Jasmine's mother, who played a critical role in the environment of abuse. Like Jason, Catherine had her own struggles. Unaddressed mental health issues, unresolved trauma, and a deep sense of emotional neglect that had shaped her entire life. Catherine, too, came from a broken home, one where love and affection were in short supply, replaced by fear and dysfunction. She had spent years hiding behind a mask of normalcy, pretending that everything was fine, pretending that her wounds didn't exist. But despite her own trauma, Catherine's role in Jasmine's life was meant to be one of nurturing, of protection, of love. And yet, for reasons that would soon become clear, Catherine could not provide any of that. Instead, she was a bystander in her own home, watching as her child suffered, unable or unwilling to intervene. Why? What was it that made her turn a blind eye to Jasmine's pain? Catherine's emotional neglect was as deep-rooted as Jason's anger. She had spent years internalizing the idea that love meant control, that emotional distance was a means of survival. Her emotional detachment from Jasmine wasn't just an absence of affection. It was a result of a lifetime spent learning that to care meant to sacrifice. To Catherine, showing too much love or tenderness was dangerous. Vulnerability was a weakness. She had learned to shut herself off, to not feel, and that emotional numbness left her unable to protect her own child when it mattered most. And it was this emotional numbness that allowed the abuse to thrive, that allowed Jasmine to suffer for so long without anyone stepping in to stop it. Jasmine's cries went unheard not just by Jason, but by Catherine as well. It was as if both parents had become numb to the child's suffering, unable to recognize the signs of abuse, unable to feel the weight of their own failures. But the abuse did not end with Jason and Catherine's inability to protect Jasmine. It was in the family dynamic that the real danger lay. This was not a story of two parents who were simply overwhelmed by the demands of raising a child. This was a story of a toxic environment, a home where emotional distance was the norm, where anger and neglect festered behind closed doors. Behind closed doors, Jasmine's parents were falling apart. What seemed like a loving family on the outside was anything but. Jason's anger and Catherine's emotional detachment created an environment ripe for abuse, one where Jasmine's cries went ignored, and where her physical and emotional needs were never met. Jasmine was caught in the crossfire of her parents' unresolved issues, and in the end, it was her that paid the ultimate price. The story of Jasmine's abuse is not just a story of parental failure. It's a story of a broken family dynamic, one that was never given the opportunity to heal. It's a story of how toxic environments, ones where abuse and neglect are allowed to fester unchecked, can breed violence and destruction. And Jasmine was the victim of that violence. But here's the real question. How many more children are out there, living in these kinds of environments where parents, caught in their own dysfunction, are failing to protect them? How many more Jasmines are suffering behind closed doors, unseen, unheard, ignored? Jasmine's death was a tragedy, yes. But it was also a wake-up call. It's a reminder that when parents fail to break free from their own trauma, when they fail to heal, they pass that brokenness on to the next generation. Jasmine's story is not just about one child. It's about the system that allowed her to fall through the cracks, about the society that failed to see the signs of a broken family, about the people who should have stepped in but didn't. In the end, it's not just about what happened to Jasmine. It's about what we, as a society, can do to prevent this from happening again. It's about making sure that the signs of abuse, the patterns of neglect, are no longer ignored. Jasmine's story should serve as a lesson, a painful, heartbreaking lesson, that we must be vigilant, we must be aware, and we must act when we see the warning signs. Jasmine's story is one that will never be forgotten. She was an innocent child, lost to a system that failed her, lost to parents who were too broken to care for her. But as we reflect on her life and on the painful end she suffered, we must ask ourselves, how many more children are slipping through the cracks? How many more will suffer if we don't change the way we look at abuse, at family dynamics, at the mental health of those who are responsible for our children's safety? We owe it to Jasmine, and to every child who suffers in silence, to break the cycle, to stop abuse before it starts, to create a world where no child has to endure what Jasmine went through, where no parent has to repeat the mistakes of their past. In the next part of this story, we'll dive into the trial, where justice will finally be served. But even as the legal process unfolds, the question remains, what will it take to truly protect our children? The courtroom was a place where truth was meant to come to light, where justice was meant to be served. But for those who gathered there, it felt more like a place of mourning than of legal proceedings. The weight of Jasmine's life, her brief but painful existence, hung in the air as the trial began. There was a sense of collective grief in the room, a deep sense of loss that no verdict could ever truly heal. The details of Jasmine's suffering, the unimaginable abuse she endured, would now be laid bare in front of a public audience. And as the truth began to unfold, the room was filled not just with sorrow, but with disbelief. Jasmine Robin Jr. was charged with capital murder. His crime was unspeakable, and it could not be denied. He had been the primary agent of the violence that led to Jasmine's death, his hands the ones that inflicted the most brutal, irreversible harm on his own daughter. Catherine White, though not the one who delivered the final blow, faced charges for neglect and failure to act, for standing by and doing nothing while Jasmine's suffering escalated to the point of no return. The charges against her were clear, yet her role in the abuse, her emotional neglect and complicity in the failure to protect Jasmine, was just as damning. The courtroom drama began with a sense of urgency. The public and Jasmine's family had been waiting for justice for months, hoping that the truth would be heard loud and clear, hoping that those responsible for this tragedy would be held accountable. The prosecution laid out the chilling facts of the case, detailing Jasmine's physical condition at the time of her death, how her injuries were deliberate, sustained, and severe. Expert witnesses testified about the extent of her suffering, the psychological toll it had taken on her tiny body, and how Jasmine's injuries could not have been accidental. Jasmine's autopsy was presented as key evidence, and the photographs of her bruised, battered body were shown to the court. The images were so devastating that some in the room struggled to hold back their tears. For Jasmine's family, it was a crushing moment. Seeing the evidence of her suffering so starkly, so painfully displayed for the world to see. But it was also a moment of reckoning. The truth was finally out in the open. No longer could anyone deny the horror Jasmine had endured. No longer could her parents hide behind the excuses they had offered. Jason sat in the defendant's chair, his face unreadable as the charges were read aloud. His lawyer tried to present a defense, tried to justify his actions, but the evidence was overwhelming. Jasmine's injuries, each one more horrific than the last, painted a picture of a man who had methodically tortured his own child. His violent past, his history of abuse, was brought into the light. The jury would soon have to decide if this was truly capital murder, if the evidence pointed to a crime so vile that the only appropriate punishment could be the death penalty. Catherine, on the other hand, remained composed. Her face was cold, her eyes distant. The prosecution didn't need to say much about her. Her failure to intervene, her failure to protect Jasmine, spoke for itself. The defense for Catherine would try to argue that she hadn't been the one to directly cause harm. They would point to her emotional neglect, saying she was a victim of her own mental health struggles, and that she hadn't known how to act. But the truth was clear. She had been there, she had seen Jasmine's suffering, and yet she had done nothing. The charges for neglect were a direct result of her inability to protect the one person she was supposed to protect above all else, her own child. As the trial progressed, the defense team tried to bring up Jason's history, attempting to cast doubt on his intentions or present mitigating circumstances. But no explanation could excuse what he had done. There was no excuse for the sustained brutality, for the repeated trauma, for the emotional destruction he had caused. And there was no excuse for Catherine either. She was his partner in this, as complicit as he was in the abuse Jasmine had suffered. She failed to protect Jasmine at every turn, and her inaction allowed the violence to continue. The case became more than just about Jason and Catherine. It became about a systemic failure. A failure to recognize the signs of abuse, a failure to step in when intervention was needed, and a failure to act when it was most urgent. Jasmine had been failed by the very system that was supposed to protect her. And now, as her parents sat in court facing charges for their actions, it was too late for her. But it wasn't too late for the lessons we could learn from her story. As the trial neared its end, the prosecution asked for justice, for accountability, for punishment. The case wasn't just about bringing a murderer to trial. It was about ensuring that no more children would fall through the cracks, that no more parents would be allowed to continue abusing their children without intervention. It was about making sure that the system could no longer turn a blind eye to the suffering of innocent lives. In the end, the jury found Jason guilty of capital murder. The evidence was undeniable, the crime too horrific to ignore. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As for Catherine, she was found guilty of injury to a child by omission, and she faced a lengthy sentence for failing to protect Jasmine from the horrors she endured. It was a moment of justice, yes, but it came too late. Jasmine would never know the peace she deserved. She would never feel the warmth of a loving home, the care of a mother and father who could have protected her. Her death was a tragic reminder of the deep, pervasive flaws in our child protection system and the devastating consequences of its failures. As the case closed, as the courtroom emptied, there was one haunting thought that lingered. Jasmine's story wasn't just her own. It was a story shared by thousands of children who suffer in silence, whose cries go unheard, whose pain is ignored. Jasmine's story should have been a wake-up call, a reminder that we cannot allow children to suffer because we are too busy, too blind, or too afraid to act. Jasmine's death was a tragedy, but it doesn't have to be in vain. We must demand change. We must fight for a system that doesn't fail our children, for a world where no child suffers in silence, where no child has to endure the horror Jasmine did. It's up to us to make sure Jasmine's story lives on, not just as a painful reminder of what went wrong, but as a call to action for all of us to protect the most vulnerable among us. What could have been done to save Jasmine? What could have been done to protect her from the horror she faced? Share your thoughts below. Tell us what you think needs to change. If you believe that we can do better, if you believe that no child should suffer the way Jasmine did, then speak up. As we reach the conclusion of Jasmine's story, I want to express my heartfelt gratitude to each and every one of my amazing subscribers. It's because of you that I am able to keep producing these deeply emotional and important videos. This journey was not easy, and I'm so thankful for your support every step of the way. If you've felt as outraged, as heartbroken as I have by this story, please like this video to show your support for justice, subscribe so we can keep bringing attention to the cases that need it most, and share this video with someone who still believes that we can't make a difference. We need to keep raising awareness, keep fighting for change, and keep giving voices to those who have been silenced. Turn on the notification bell so you're always the first to know when I drop another important story. Thank you for being part of this movement. Together we can make a difference. Jasmine's story was one of loss, of a life cut short by those who should have loved her. But it's also a story about us, about how we must never stop asking the hard questions, about how we must never turn a blind eye to the suffering of the vulnerable. Jasmine's memory will live on, and through her we must find the strength to change.